Well, we were in Genesis 37 last week. We're going to be in Genesis 39 this week. I was glad to see a little more humility from people in general as we were moving into a new year. We talked last week a little bit about that transition into a new year. You know, we went just booming into 2020, thinking this is going to be a new year. I mean, 2020, that sounds like science fiction. 2020 didn't end up being the year we thought it would be. That's okay. 2021 will be better. We went marching into 2021, and that turned out to be very difficult for some people. I was glad to see some sentiments about a little more sobriety, a little more humility going into 2022. I saw someone post this. They said, 2022 is like a helicopter. I don't know how to operate a helicopter. I thought that was pretty good. That's, 2022. I don't know how to do this, but I'm going to go into it. I'm just going to be cool and just hope it doesn't bite back too much. There's a sense of humility and a sense of walking cautiously. That's okay. We as evangelicals need to have that as well. In addition to that, then, too, there's also kind of a sense of imminent concern. You talk to a lot of other believers, and they kind of have a lot of concern about where are we as a country, where are we headed. There's kind of a sense of aloneness. We might feel alone as a church sometimes. I talked to some people the other day, and, you feel like you're trying to do your best, but all you hear about is the problems of the big churches or all the fruit that goes on at the big churches. There's a lot of little churches that are doing what they should be doing, and yet you feel alone. Christians feel like they're alone in their concerns for this country or their pursuit of spiritual growth. You might just feel alone for a variety of personal reasons. Going into a new year, feeling alone, feeling like you're not sure what your steps are going to be like. Definitely feeling like you need a shepherd. Definitely feeling like you need the presence of God in your life. These are the times when our theology really needs to overcome some of those feelings, and we have to overcome what we feel with what we know. And I think that's going to be true for Joseph as well. Today we're going to be discussing how we need to know that God is present, whether you sense him, whether you feel him near, whether you experience him or not. In fact, if you want to look at your handout, the persistent says at the top, the persistent presence of God. That's kind of our theme for today, and I've got that down on the third point, the first bullet point of the third, where it says God is present when Joseph encounters profound setback. We're assured that God was with Joseph, and then that's our kind of a theme for today. God is present whether you sense him or feel him near or experience him or not. We're going to try to say that several times today. Because even as Christians, we know we got our theology, we got our doctrines, these are important, and this is why those things are important. To say, I need to know that God is here, that God is with me, that God loves me, whether I sense it, whether I get it, whether I mystically appreciate it or feel it or not. Because most of the time we won't. That's where the theology needs to be there. This is true in temptation. I know that God is here. This is true in sorrow. This is true in blessing. Hey, I'm blessed. Now I can just do this on my own. No, you still need God to be shepherding you during that time. This is true in feelings of abandonment, like what Joseph is going through here. In fact, I want you to just look with me. In fact, if you like underlining or highlighting or whatever you like to do, I just want to walk through chapter 39 with you and point out one phrase that I think is really going to be the crux of this chapter. For all Joseph's ups and downs, I want you to look at chapter 39, verse 2. Let's start there. And we'll go back over all this in just a minute, but just look at the first phrase, the Lord was with Joseph. I took out my orange highlighter, and I underlined that phrase, the Lord was with Joseph. Verse 3, it says, the Lord was with him. Someone else noticed that the Lord was with him. Drop all the way down to verse 21. But, and you say, there's a contrast here. What are we in contrast to? Well, we're in contrast to the ground falling out from underneath Joseph. But, what does it say? Go ahead and underline this phrase. The Lord was with Joseph. Verse 23, halfway through, the Lord was with him. Okay? Now, I'm not too bright. I guess if you tell me something once or twice, maybe, but if you're going to tell me 4 times in one chapter, I'm not too bright, but I think even as a guy, I think even I'm going to get that. No matter what Joseph is going to go through in this chapter, God is with him. This is true during Joseph's successes in the first part of the chapter. It is true during Joseph's heartaches. In the second half, the persistent presence of God bookends the dramatic transition that is going to take place in Joseph's life. He thinks he's been through the worst of it, by the way. He thinks, oh man, my brother's throwing me in a pit and selling me. That was the worst. Oh, well, at least I'll never have to go through anything like that again. Oh, Joe, you don't know, but he's not read chapter 39 yet. He doesn't know. But I'll tell you what, he's going to have a hard time with all these things that he's going through. He's going to have a hard time remembering this the way you do also and the way I do. That God is there. God is present. God is shepherd, whether we feel it or know it, or whether we feel it or experience God's presence or not. None of that matters. What matters is that God is there, and I think we're going to see that in this chapter today. So let's start with verses 1 through 6. God is present when Joseph enjoys personal advancement. And let me just do a little bit of review. We saw in Genesis 37 the childishness and the immaturity of his brothers. These guys, they're successful, they've got wealth, they got families, and they're upset because Joe got this really flashy, beautiful coat from Jacob. Okay, this enrages them. And then the dreams, we went through all of this, and these guys act very childishly, and their childishness gets dangerous. Their immaturity gets homicidal. They decide not to kill him, let's sell him for money, which I guess it's better for Joseph. I don't know if that's a more mature option, really, but that's what they end up doing, and that's why he is in the situation he's in. Now, we didn't spend a lot of time in Genesis 38. It's a kind of a PG-13 kind of chapter. I'll let you read it on your own. Just to illustrate, you think these guys together are childish. Let me show you about one of them named Judah. I don't know if he'll ever be significant down the road, like the progenitor of the Messiah, but let's just focus on one of them and how childish one of them behaves and gets himself in this ridiculous scandal. Now, we saw with Reuben last week, Reuben stepped up, even though we saw Reuben not doing so well before. Later on in Joseph's story, we're going to see Judah step up, okay? Judah's going to have a little bit of kind of personal redemption here, so that's good. But we're dealing with a lot of childishness. And like we talked about last week, childishness is going to happen. You're dealing with adults. You're dealing with people some of whom have never gotten past their childish whatever from their childhood. And there's going to be a lot of difficulty. Joseph is again going to be victimized by the folly, by the foolishness of those around him. And that's where we pick them up here in Genesis chapter 39. So let me just read these first few verses of Genesis 39 again. Kind of like Dwayne said, we're familiar with these stories. But don't let that over-familiarity lull you into missing some of the really important points here. Genesis 39, verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, the Egyptian officer to Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. It came about from the time he made him overseer in the house, and over all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon him and all that he owned in his house and his fields. So he left nothing that he owned in he left everything that he owned in Joseph's charge. And with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Good. So this is, remember, this is a bad, 37 was a bad chapter for Joseph. Things might start to be looking up, but we're given this important reminder, God is with Joseph. So Joseph's time in Potiphar's house is a pretty familiar tale, and I think it emphasizes at least 2 points. First of all, God's sovereign involvement in Joseph's life. And I think that's the important, the persistent presence of God no matter what Joseph is going to go through. This chapter is also going to show us Joseph's willingness to bloom where he's planted. I know we use that phrase a lot. That was a phrase that I remember hearing at a time when I was really discontent with where I was, and the pastor used that phrase, and that really connected with me. Bloom where you're planted. Now, we know the end of the story. God is going to put Joseph in second command of Egypt. It seems to me there are 2 paths to get there. He can rise up through the rank of Potiphar's household. And Potiphar's he's a captain of the guard, he's pretty close to the Pharaoh. He just kind of a linear rise up all the way through until he's second in command of Egypt. That's not the route that God wants him to go on. He doesn't know that. He doesn't know where he's going to end up. He only knows where he is. By the way, that's like you do. You don't know where God's going to take you. And you think, I would just like the linear, predictable route. Is that cool? That's not cool with God. Because for him, that unpredictable and difficult route is going to be the route where he teaches you and where he draws you closer to himself. So that when you get to where he's taking you, you will recognize you didn't get there because of you, you got there because of him. And that's what Joseph, I think, is going to see very powerfully here. Potiphar's wife doesn't have to do this to Joseph. It's something very unjust. And again, we're going to see that. Potiphar doesn't have to believe her without, doing some investigation. So instead of this constant social mobility, Joseph is going to end up in a very difficult situation. Your problems are serious. My problems are serious, but keep them in perspective and remember that these difficulties that we go through do not mean the absence of God. And train yourself to see these as movements of God rather than the absence of God. When we go through these difficulties, what's the first thing we do? Where is God? Why did God allow this? What is God doing? Where is God in my life? Train yourself to see these things as the movements of God from one place to another, moving you from one place to another, rather than the absence of God. And this is unfortunately what the world does. So again, we have in verse 2 this phrase repeated that the Lord was with Joseph. We're going to see that. We went through this. We're going to see that in verse 2, in verse 3. We're going to see that twice at the end of the chapter as well. Joseph prospered with the Lord helping him. And in verse 3, his boss notices that. Now, when it says there in verse 3, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, does Potiphar see Joseph doing supernatural, parting the dishes or something like whatever Moses is going to have, something supernatural and dramatic? No, he just looks at Joseph and says, man, you're employing a wisdom, a morality, an integrity. I don't see that around here. That must mean that there's something transcendent and supernatural about you. And you know what? I hope that people see that in us as well. That they look at us and they say, you know what? Something really special is going on with you and in your life. And we use that as an opportunity to point right directly to God, right directly to Christ. Say, well, that's why. It's Christ. It's what Christ has done in my life. What a great evangelistic opportunity that Joseph has here. The Hebrew word is salach. That sounds like Klingon, but salach. It means to advance or to prosper. It is used in verse 2. It is used in verse 3. It is used later on in the chapter also in verse 23 at the end. So we have these two things. We have the persistent presence of God, and we have that driving and motivating and encouraging Joseph's advancement and prosperity. Now, I'm sure Joseph could just sit there and mope about what's happened to me and complain about his brothers. Oh man, they're the worst. Here I thought they were going to be, help me out, and they ended up, selling me off. He could spend a lot of time griping about those things. But as much as he has to carry that pain with him, he is still able to do what he needs to do and allow God to work through him to provide him some prosperity. And other people are going to see that. And again, this is, notice what it says in verse 4. So Joseph found favor in his sight. Again, in Potiphar's sight, became his personal attendant. What a great thing. What a personal prosperity and wisdom can be a great evangelistic tool or a great entry point to the gospel, and I think we need to use them as that way. God blesses Joseph. He keeps climbing through Potiphar's house. Potiphar's house and fields are blessed. We see that in verse 5. Joseph is given tremendous authority. I mean, for a foreigner to have this kind of authority in an Egyptian's home, this is really remarkable. Joseph believes that the Lord is with him. That's evident to others. Just remember, the Lord isn't with him more in prosperity than in difficulty. The Lord is with you. The Lord is with you when he's setting a table in front of your enemies, like the psalmist, Psalm 23 said. He is with you when you go through the valley of the shadow of death. That is a constant. Your circumstances are not a constant. The presence of God is a constant. The Lord is with you whether you prosper or not. And we just tend to assume it and accept it more when things are going well. We sometimes forget that when things aren't going very well. I want to mention a few points here, if I could. Again, verse 4, it says, Joseph found favor in his sight, in the sight of Potiphar. You know, I think some Christians kind of have this saying like, oh, I don't care what people think about me, I'm just doing this for the Lord. I don't see that as a scriptural thing. When you have a choice in your life to say, I'm going to obey God or obey man, that is, they're completely contradictory. The Bible is very clear. We obey God, not man. That choice doesn't happen a lot in our lives. Sometimes it does, and some people are having to deal with that. I think pleasing God typically has the benefit of being able to find favor with people as well. And I think we should care what people think about us. We are representatives of God. Paul's very clear that we are ambassadors for Christ. We need to make sure that we are not trying to impress people, but that we're not certainly chasing people away or giving people the wrong impression about the gospel. And I want to mention something else too. Potiphar and all the other characters that Joseph is going to encounter over these next few chapters, they would never have encountered the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph if it weren't for Joseph's profound misfortunes. They would never have had any interaction with God if it weren't for the horrible things that Joseph went through. And we always do that. I do it, you do it. The first thing we go through something terrible, the first thing we say is, where's God? Well, I think this chapter reminds us of the persistent presence of God. And the next thing we say is, why? Childish questions, honestly. But when we're going through it, it's not childish to us. Those are legitimate questions. And we don't get the answer that satisfies us, but as far as I can tell, these people are never going to encounter the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob if it weren't for the horrible things that Joseph went through. Consider that the horrible things that you and I go through might be repositioning so that God can make himself more evident to someone else. God repositions Joseph unpleasantly. There's nothing fun about being thrown in a pit and sold to Ishmaelites and being sold to the Egyptians. God repositioned Joseph unpleasantly to bring people to a knowledge of himself. That might be true for you and I as well. Remember, we appreciate God in the good times, but know God is present whether you sense him or feel him near or experience him or not. Now we've got that background. Let's move on in the story, picking it up in verse 7, or really the phrase right before verse 7. It's still in verse 6. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And you think, I don't see why that matters at all. I don't know why I have to know that. Well, it turns out that that's going to be very important to the story. And we'll continue. Verse 7. It came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in his house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God? Okay, so things are going well. Things are going well for Joseph. Things are going good. As good as they could be, considering that he's been rejected by his family and sold into Egyptian slavery, essentially. Things are going pretty well. And you really sense God's blessing and presence in your life. Everything falls apart. You don't always get a warning about that, by the way. Like, hey, in 2 months, something terrible is going to happen. You don't get a warning about these things. It just falls apart. What is this kind of experience? How does it affect, it affects your life. How does it affect God's presence in your life? Well, again, I think we need to know that it doesn't affect God's presence in our life. He is still present in the things that we do. So Joseph is handsome. I think we can read into this even a little bit more if you'll allow me to do that. It's not just the handsome. There's something about the foreignness, the exotic nature of Joseph, perhaps. We have Potiphar. Potiphar's often out and doing military kinds of things. So now we have Mrs. Potiphar, who is at home alone. This is the Desperate Housewives of Cairo or whatever. I don't know exactly. They have a show or whatever. But now this is interesting too. There's something else that I want to slip in. We haven't gone through the entire book of Genesis. We're just focusing on this part of it. But I want to take you back just a little bit earlier in Genesis. A previous Egyptian ruler almost took Abraham's wife Sarah, and I say took in biblical sense, almost took Abraham's wife Sarah in Genesis 12. There were two other times in Genesis where a foreign ruler tries to take a Jewish man's wife. Sarah again in Genesis 20, and Isaac's wife Rebekah in Genesis 26. So there's three times in Genesis that a foreign ruler tries to take a Jewish man's wife. Here, instead of an Egyptian ruler trying to take a Jewish man's wife, an Egyptian wife tries to take a Jewish man. There seems like there's a lot of irony in there, but there's been several times. By the way, what has happened those previous times? There was a little bit of a lapse in integrity. There was a little bit of deception there, where Abraham said, "Tell the Egyptian ruler that you're my sister, not my wife." Well, that's dumb. I don't know what you think about self-protection. It was true; they were half siblings. That was a thing back then. But so there was some truth to that, but there was a lack of integrity there. Here, this fourth time around, where we have this kind of crazy foreigner with a Jewish person, here there is integrity, full integrity being used, and that's something I think we're supposed to take from this. He refuses the advances of Mrs. Potiphar, and he noted. I want you to think about, and I want you to look with me at verses 8 and 9. And as I was thinking about this morning, I wrote this down if I can read it. Articulating your reasons for purity can be helpful. It's true, and we'll look at some verses about fleeing, but you know what? When you're tempted, to be able to intellectually articulate those reasons can be very helpful. I think a lot of people struggle with addictions. We talked about this in the last hour as well. I think being able to not just overcome the addiction physiologically, but also intellectually and spiritually and theologically, I think will be helpful. And that's kind of what he does here. He's going to explain himself to her. He says all these things. He says, listen, I'm not going to, the master trusted Joseph, and he would not betray that trust. And you know what? There's a legitimate social vocational reason there. That's clearly legitimate. If he had stopped there, I think it would have been okay. Hey, you're on the right track there, Joseph. But Joseph also recognizes, even with the few moral principles, at this point there wasn't a, like with Moses' law, that's going to come several generations later. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, they don't have a how to be a faithful Jew kind of a booklet or something like that. They just know morally that would be wrong. He recognized, even with the few moral principles that he had during the patriarchs, during this dispensation, that he still had an obligation to God to maintain his purity and his integrity. In fact, he notes this at the end of verse 9. He says, listen, this would be a great evil. Now, Joseph doesn't know this. This is extraordinarily politically incorrect. You're not allowed to talk about evil because evil implies moral absolutes. And we don't talk about evil, we talk about someone who's dysfunctional, or they have a thing, or they have a whatever, or they're just trying to be the person that they're whatever they are. The reality is even back here, Joseph says, there is right or wrong. He doesn't have the law, he doesn't have Romans, Ephesians, he doesn't have the Bible, he doesn't have a canon, but he still recognizes there is right and there is wrong. That would be wrong. And it doesn't matter what's going to happen, I'm going to stand by the right nature of what I think needs to happen. And I gotta imagine he knows this gal, he knows that she's probably kind of a crazy, he knows that there's probably gonna be some negative blowback from this. Okay? He says it's wrong. There is good and evil. There is right and wrong. And again, even as that becomes more politically incorrect in our society, we have to stand up and say there is right and wrong. I don't care what you think. I don't care what the response is. I don't care if you ban me on Facebook or Twitter. There is right and wrong. I will stand on that, because standing on that is a reflection of my understanding of the omniscience, of the sovereignty, and of the presence of God in my life. And he goes on to say, I can't do this great evil and sin against God. So he was just kind of implying a moral perfection or a moral standard, and now he explicitly says, I'm not going to sin here against God. And I think it's important that he does it. Now, remember, Moses is writing this to a group of people who are wandering in the desert, and he's just given them law. But it's kind of funny, as he's writing the book of Genesis, he's trying to show examples of people who obey the law or disobey the law to their detriment even before the law was given. This is one of the 10 Commandments. Joseph doesn't know that at the time. Everybody subsequently will understand that. And we look back and say, wow, even before the law was given, he was appreciating the value of transcendent divine morality, and he was abiding by that even at that time. Eventually, she catches him, and I'm just going to, if you'll allow me to just kind of, I think you know the story well, just kind of move a little more quickly through the story. Eventually, she catches him at a time when there are few people around. In verse 11, one day he went into the house to do his work. None of the other men in the household were inside. She grabs his garment. She's physically trying to pull him toward herself. He escapes from the garment, leaves it behind, and well, he's had a problem with garments, hasn't he? Garments have not been, he's got a, I don't know, I just thought that was kind of a funny thing. Garments have been a bit of a problem in Joseph's life. Well, he abandons this one. Previously, a garment was rent from him. Here again, it is taken from him, but in probably more of a good way, as he escapes from Mrs. Potiphar and the garment, and thinks, okay, well, good. I got away from temptation. I'm good to go now. I did right. I did the right thing. Things are going to be fine. They're not fine. Mrs. Potiphar does not take kindly to her advances being rejected, and she uses this empty garment. Again, the second time, in just a few chapters, where an empty garment was used, or a former garment of Joseph's was used to falsely accuse him or make create a false narrative about him, which I think is very interesting. And we'll circle back to that in just a minute. And she says this in verses 14 and 15. She called the men of the household. Hey, she yells. She calls them. See, who's he? Who's that he right there? The first he is Potiphar. Potiphar is the one that caused my husband, he's the one that caused all these problems. He has brought a Hebrew to us to make sport of us. He came to me to lie with me. I screamed, I'm the victim. When he heard that I had raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me, and he fled and went outside. Okay, so she tells this, she creates this story, tells this lie. She's the victim. She's the one that's been hampered by all of this. Which is interesting, because then she does it again in verse 17. So Potiphar comes home. She speaks to her husband these words. This Hebrew slave whom you brought to us came into me to make sport of me, and I raised my voice and screamed, and he left the garment beside him and fled outside. By the way, you can keep repeating this wrong story. That doesn't make it right. I'm only thinking of a few news networks when I'm thinking of all of them. But anyway, you keep repeating the same story. That doesn't make it right. But she's concocted this whole narrative, and she's got the garment to prove it. By the way, isn't it funny how people talk about proof today? She's holding an empty garment. That doesn't prove anything. It really doesn't prove anything. So be careful what people say is proof today. I don't know if I buy all the things that they're telling us to prove. She reiterates this lie as though that would make it more true or more authoritative. I want to mention something. I want to back up to something we talked about last week when we were talking about Jacob's favoritism for Joseph. And just to remind you that we have to be careful going through these narrative pieces, not to over-moralize them, not to turn them into Aesop's fables. If you're hearing this about Joseph running from temptation, that's great. If the Lord is pricking your heart about, I need to make sure that I'm also separating myself from temptation, that's something you need to study. I don't think that that's what this is a good example. I don't think that this is what this passage is teaching. But if you have to study that so that you can overcome some things on your own, let me give you a little bit of a boost here. 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee immorality. Every other sin that a man commits is outside the body, but the immoral man sins against his own body. And there's a whole passage there about overcoming temptation in general, this kind of temptation specifically. 2 Tim 2:22, yes, 2 Tim 2:22. Says, now flee from youthful lusts and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. Okay? So there's other places to go if you want a more specific teaching about overcoming temptation or fleeing from sexual immorality. I think that's part of what he's saying here, but I think there's a bigger message here. And there's a temptation to teach the micro elements of the passage, but I think there's a bigger point here. And it is about God blessing the one who exercises integrity and providing his presence to that person. Joseph's integrity is not going to stand against, or is going to look like it's not going to stand against the false accusations about from Mrs. Potiphar. And then, by the way, look at verse 19. Now when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, "This is what you have done, this is what your slave has done to me," his anger burned. He didn't follow up on this. He didn't bring Joseph in and say, "Listen, dude, watch your words carefully. I'm pretty upset here, but I'm at least before I do anything rash, I want to hear your side of the story." And he's going to hear a very different side of the story. One that he might believe by this point because he's seen Joseph's integrity in other areas. He doesn't do that. Joseph is a double victim of injustice here. The initial act, and then not having a fair trial. Not in a legal sense, but in a social or in a vocational sense. And this hinders the positive course of his upward trajectory for Joseph. Of course, God's intentions are going to triumph over these misfortunes that Joseph experiences. Let me mention a few things before we move on to the next passage about integrity. Joseph's integrity did not serve him well in the short term. Right? He could have got away with some stuff here. But instead, he decided to choose integrity. And that turned out to be a terrible thing for him in the short term. Our pastor says you shouldn't have integrity. No, that's not what I'm saying. Don't walk away from this. What I'm saying is, make sure we're not pragmatists about our morality. I embrace integrity because it's going to help me. That's not why we do integrity. Because it's going to help me. Because oftentimes it's going to hurt you in the short term. We are not pragmatists. We don't do good because it is best only in the short term, or because it's socially expedient, or because people can see it. If some short-term good comes out of our integrity, great. That's terrific. And that does happen a lot, by the way. It does happen. That's good. But the short-term result is not why we utilize purity and integrity. We exhibit integrity and purity knowing that God is in control. We do it because we know that he's present. Whether you feel it, whether you sense it, whether you're experiencing his presence or not. In that case, whatever setbacks or misunderstandings or difficulties ensue from our use of integrity, or even if they occur generally or as a direct result of our integrity, these are not really setbacks or misunderstandings, but God repositioning us to where he wants us to be. And you say, that's not fair. I don't think God cares about that. I think he cares about putting you where he wants you to be. God's repositioning of us is not always pleasant, but it does, and sometimes there's problems and difficulties there, but it sometimes takes us away from problems and difficulties. And I think we need to be mindful of that. And I'll mention this too briefly. Sometimes a little vindication from one's integrity, you're going to get that too, and that's a nice thing. Don't wallow in it. Don't be a poor loser like I am, or a poor winner like I am sometimes. But sometimes you get a little vindication. This evil little thought popped into my mind. I'm going to share it with you. Don't you think that at some, Joseph, we know the story, Joseph's going to become second in Egypt, second in charge. Don't you think at some administrative function or at some party, he's going to run into Potiphar? Oh, Joe. Hey, buddy. And then guess who walks up? Mrs. Potiphar. Hey, well, this is awkward. And Joe's like, well, it's not awkward for me. I'm having a lot of fun here. I mean, a little bit of vindication there. I don't know if you've ever received that. I've had some difficult church things happen, and to get a little bit of vindication, sometimes a lot of vindication, sometimes just a little bit. A couple of people saying, hey man, what happened to you, that was horrible, that was terrible. And you say, you know what, thank you. I thought so too at the time, and I appreciate you saying that. I trust your judgment. You know the situation, and I appreciate that. Either way, to know that God is with us even during those times. when we are exercising integrity. We got a few minutes left. Let's get into verses 20 through 23. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in jail. So let's just deal with that briefly. Don't you think Joseph tried to plead his case at this point? Joseph is trying to say something, and Potiphar's not going to hear about it. He gets a couple big, mean guys to throw him and drag him into this jail. This is worst case scenario, isn't it? This is worst case scenario. He's not thrown into a common, whatever prison. He's thrown into a prison for people who have offended the king himself. People are not going to be treated well in this place. Okay, they're not going to be treated well. That's bad, right? Actually, this is the quickest way he's going to get to second place in Egypt. This is the best place for him to be to get where God wants him to be. Do you think he thinks that at the time? Man, I've been doing so well, and then I'm back down here. Do you think he thinks at the time, hey, this is the best place I could be, to be second place in Egypt? Probably not. He's probably not thinking that. Even in prison, Joseph is well positioned. And when something difficult happens to us, what do? We're so unhappy about where we are, we're not thinking about how God could use us to get us to where he wants us to be. This dramatic downturn in Joseph's life clearly means that God has abandoned Joseph. Okay, very good. So you're going, no, it's not Pastor Matt. I know you're not 5-year-olds, but no, that's not true. You feel, this is what you feel, though. You've been there. You've not been here, but you've been there. And you think, it's as though what I'm going through is clear evidence. Maybe a friend will say, well, where's your God now? And maybe that gets in your head a little bit. Where is God now? God is the same place he's been. In the ups and in the downs. In fact, you as the reader might be thinking that too. Where is God now? I mean, where is he? So that's exactly what the text goes into in verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph. Remember, we talked about this before. There's this contrast. What is it in contrast to? But the Lord was with Joseph. Well, the contrast is with him looking around and thinking, how did I end up here? This is the worst place I've ever been. Surely, as my brothers abandoned me, as everybody treated me with injustice, surely God has abandoned me. And in light of that feeling that Joseph certainly must have had, because as a human being, that it's hard to feel anything else, the text says, but in contrast, God was with Joseph. And extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for. You're looking at this Joseph and you think, man, this guy, it doesn't matter where he is, this guy he's prospering. That's fantastic. Verse 23, the chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge. Didn't worry about anything. It would have been nice, again, if others would have afforded him that same respect for his integrity, but hey, what a great place to be when you say, hey, do you want it or no? I trust what you're doing. You're good. You're a good guy. I trust what you're doing. I got other stuff to do. Anything under Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. So a couple of things here. We are assured twice in these next verses that God was with Joseph. I love this too. In verse 21, there it says, God, the Lord was with Joseph, and then it takes that next step. This is really important as well. You think he's in a miserable situation, as bad of a situation as you can be in, and yet it says God extended kindness to him. The word to extend is the word to literally in the top, to stretch out, to reach out in some way. And the word for kindness, oh man, here it comes. I'm not going to get through the next hymn either. It's great is thy faithfulness. I'm going to have a hard time getting through that. God stretches out to Joseph with chesed. Chesed. The love, faithfulness, kindness. There's no English word that can translate what God is reaching out to Joseph with right here. You think, well, it'd be a kindness if you get me out of here. but that's not what God's point was. He was right where God wanted him to be. But while you're there, you're going to get lots of chesed. You're going to get lots of faithfulness. You're going to get lots of love. You're going to get lots of help from God. God reaches out to Joseph with chesed. We can enjoy the we can enjoy the kindnesses of God, knowing even in the worst situations, but only if we're looking for them and only if we're open to them. I hate to keep coming back to this, but man, the bottom falls out from under us, and we're there in the pit of whatever circumstances we're in, and we're too busy complaining to appreciate the multiple kindnesses that God is showing us even there. And I do it, and you do it, we all do it. It's a thing, but Joseph is going to enjoy some chesed from God, and then notice how too it says. In verse 21, God gave him hain. Hain is the word for grace. Gave him favor or grace. Again, with this impression that he gives to the chief jailer. Joseph enjoys even more opportunities for personal advancement here in jail. The chief jailer gave these things into Joseph's hands. So you think, well, I'm at the worst point in my life. Well, but God and the chief jailer and everybody's giving him things, even at this nadir, this low point in his life. All the prisoners, a great deal of authority are given to him. And then it's funny, at the end of verse, let's see, what verse is it? At the end of verse 22, it says, whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The Hebrew just says, all which was done there, he did it. Okay, he did everything. Joseph had authority to do whatever he wanted to. Joseph didn't have a lot of administrative experience before he was sold into slavery, did he? I don't think he had a lot of administrative experience. He had more experience spying and snitching, because that was kind of his thing. Not a lot of administrative experience, not a lot of overseeing. In this chapter, Joseph's misfortunes and misadventures have provided him tremendous administrative experience on both ends of the social spectrum. In a high-ranking official's household and in the king's prison. I wonder, it makes me think that there might be some more administrative opportunities for Joseph in the future. Do you think? I wonder. It almost feels like God is preparing him for something bigger and better. I don't know. I haven't read I don't know what's going to happen. I just have a funny feeling that God is preparing him for something. And we laugh at that. That's kind of funny. Well, what about you? Don't discount the experience that your difficult situations can provide. Rather than looking for things to complain about, I'm a complainer. That's why I talk about it all the time. I'm complaining about my complaining. I'm a complainer. Rather than looking for things to complain about, or how can I get out of this situation? And listen, if you're in a bad situation, you can get out of a bad situation, Don't forget to look for what you can learn through that situation. Because that may be a college course to prepare you for something more important down the road that God has for you. Don't be discouraged when things go badly. Again, our scriptural theology kicks in to remind us that God is present, whether we sense him or feel him near or experience him or not. And that's true for you. What is God? You're going through something tough right now. What is God teaching you? And it's okay to want to get out of it. That's okay. But what is God teaching you through this? A lesson that he might be preparing you for. And in the middle of this, don't forget that God is present. That means we have his benefits, we have the kindnesses, we have the chesed of God. And it also means we have to maintain our integrity because we know that God is near and that God is present. I hope you will keep those lessons in your mind and apply them to some things you go through this week. Let's close with, oh boy.